Today I want to talk about a very necessary subject, a subject that is not, I think, talked about much at all, but most definitely needs to be. And I call it the problem of derangement. And this then would be something that could be called the philosophy of derangement. So here goes. And I've sort of touched on this issue before, but I did so in the context of Nietzsche. Because what I was saying of Nietzsche is that in his last works, he seems to have been moving gradually towards an understanding of him taking himself out of what he sees as the derangement of Western civilization, particularly, of course, German civilization, but also English. And these things percolate up in his mind. It comes up very clearly in that work which is most disregarded, namely Ecce Homo. It comes up as a theme over and over again, and it's an important one for him. He seems to have distilled his idea of what his own philosophy is really about. And post-Zarathustra, he seems to be becoming clearer on that matter. He's not just trying to outline a philosophy and metaphysics, which he does, as I've already pointed out. He's not just trying to do that. He's trying to say something about what he, at his time, because this is the way that time spoke, the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th, was the health of humanity, the health of man. To what degree is man unhealthy? And what are the causes of this unhealth, this lack of health in him? Now, I can only speak really, as could Nietzsche, I can only really speak about Western human beings, because those are all really I know. But it's also because if there is a problem, and I see it as an enormous problem, then it's a problem that I essentially see in the West. I'm not sure that it's getting much worse anywhere else. You can correct me if I'm wrong about that, and it would be an interesting argument to have. But I'm only really familiar with the West, and I see it as a huge problem, the problem of derangement in the West, in its citizens, but it's particularly notable at the moment, on the day that I'm recording this, in the government of the West, in particularly the EU and NATO, as they exist as Western powers. And I think they are particularly disastrous. I can only wonder what Nietzsche would have thought of this problem had he confronted it. I think he would have been utterly dismayed and perhaps terrified of what he's seeing, of what one is seeing today. Now, so Nietzsche, as it were, takes the story up to the end of the 19th century. But all one can say is that whatever he was seeing at the end of the 19th century as what he would have called, and did call, the decadence of human beings at the end of the 19th century, what can one say? It has galloped forward and at an exponential rate as we have gone through the 20th century, so that now in the 21st century, it seems to have leapt up even higher again into something which is at catastrophic levels. And I'm sorry if that sounds hyperbolic, but I think it's true. And what I want to do is just simply to say something about this derangement of human beings. I've also talked about this whole topic in the past, and I made the point that for me, one of the heroes of the 19th century, the one who pointed out, as it were, that the road to perdition was lying in front of us. And it was a simple fact of that we were no longer, if we had ever been, but we were increasingly giving in to the idea of believing things which we had no reason to believe. That we were believing things for absurd reasons, because, as William James put it, and as William James pushed it on people like it was a drug, William James's idea that there was a will to believe, and that one could will oneself to believe things of which one had no reason to believe. And it was William Clifford who resisted this idea and who argued that all belief, all genuine belief, proper belief, everything that is not a sham of a belief, must be a belief for which one has good reasons, preferentially evidential reasons. And he pointed out that we increasingly did not have this for our beliefs, that we were bereft of this, and that we had, as it were, with James, dived into this appalling mess of belief for which all we had was our desire to believe it. This, for Clifford, was a very, very bad road. Well, I will say that he was right, and that we have come almost to the end of that road, and that what we are now seeing is that people's beliefs are now not based on evidence. Evidence is something that is being shunned, and instead people are believing things because it's a narrative that suits them, that is convenient to them. They are willing to themselves to believe things for which they have no reasons other than conformity with a narrative. That is one of the big things that has happened to us. Now, if we put that together with what Nietzsche says, then we can make some sense out of this in terms of how human beings have, as it were, not progressed, but regressed, degenerated into something which is extremely dangerous for us, and that we are now at a terrible point for humanity, as I'll come to. The foundation layer for this derangement of human beings starts with food. This is one of the things that Nietzsche realized and points out in Ecce Homo. It's food. We are eating food that is not nutritious. We started to do this at the end of the 19th century in Nietzsche's own time. But it progressed rapidly into the 20th century. We started off in the 20th century as not too bad, and the diseases of modernity that we suffer, heart attacks, strokes, cancers, all of the things that are the diseases of modernity. Those things were rare at the beginning of the 20th century, but became increasingly prevalent at the end of the 20th century. We think that we are doing well. We've given ourselves all sorts of excuses for why we are in a terrible state physically, why we are obese, why our obesity is not something which we are treating, why we are doing all of the wrong things in terms of eating food, and why we are dying of all of the diseases which surround and are part of the epidemic of obesity. Why all of this is happening is because of the food that we are eating and that we are being encouraged to eat and that is being forced on us by the supermarkets not having really much else to choose from. We are being force-fed terrible, terrible food and we are eating it, and we are eating it on the recommendations of doctors who should have found out that what they were recommending was wrong, but seem not to have bothered to update themselves on the problems of diet and the problems of the dietary recommendations, which are, of course, as you would guess, all being funded by what is called big food, which is become a humorous expression, but is no joke. And then when one gets diseases from this food, heart disease, diabetes, etc., cancers, why these are then treated by what is, again, laughingly called, but not laughingly at all, Big Pharma. This is the first two layers of this. We have been increasingly eating the food which is terrible for us and not eating the food which we need. And then when there are problems, then we are treating those problems with drugs coming from as in the form of pharmaceuticals. And we are, of course, self-medicating in the form, particularly with things like depression. We are self-medicating with alcohol, and that alcohol then precipitates the diabetes, etc., etc. All of the things that, if you're aware of health, you must be aware of by now. And by being aware of health, I don't really mean being sort of, as it were, talked to by the health industry, which is almost entirely misleading on these subjects. But I mean, if you find out for yourself what's going on, then you'll be aware of that. Now, I mean, and one of the tests of that, well, is if you try what these people recommend to you, the people who are as it were, diagnosing and then misrepresenting and then advocating for particular remedies, if you try them and they don't work, then you know they're lying. Because there's a lot of research that's gone into this. Much of it has been repressed. Everything has been repressed that is not conducive to the story that they want to tell you. And so one has to do one's own research in this. And if you do, then you will know what a trap all of this is. And fortunately, Mr. Kennedy is now in office in order to try to correct this problem. So there's as it were, an official representation to try to undo these problems. Let's leave those two things besides, because there are good people and professionals who can recommend these things, as I can't, since I'm not a medical professional. But Georgia Ede is probably one of my favorites. Dr. Anthony Chafee is also one of my favorites, and he's a neurophysiologist, I think, or a neurosurgeon, I can't remember which. He is very good and very blunt, which is also good. That's what one needs. And then there are others as well. By the way, I want to, when I'm making recommendations, I should also at this point make a recommendation for this whole subject, which I've been motivated to talk about today, from Neil Oliver. I regard him as one of the most eloquent things on the internet, and one of the things which makes the internet actually worthwhile. If you listen to his monologues for a short while, you'll realize that his eloquence is really astonishing, and that he is, I think, spot on in his analysis of what's going wrong. So you could regard what I'm saying as something like a footnote to him, or you can regard myself as simply putting forward things that I've long regarded as the essentials that we philosophers, don't talk about. He talks about things from a slightly different perspective, but nevertheless, we are, I think, on the same page to a large extent. And I hope I'm not getting beyond myself by saying that. I hope he doesn't immediately repudiate what I'm saying by saying we're not on the same page at all. And he, as he well might, bluntly, if he feels that way. Those are the first two layers, really, and they basically are the encroaching things on the 20th century that have really caused us physically to be in the position that we are today. Health, diet, and pharmaceuticals in order to treat the problems of the diet which we have been recommended to have. All of this galloped away from the 1970s onwards, starting in the 1960s. But in the 60s, most people were fairly healthy, even though they grew up in England in the shadow of the Second World War, and I'm familiar with that situation. But of course, across all of Europe was under the shadow of the Second World War, and most people in the 60s grew up pretty healthy, despite that. But then in the 70s, things changed. And then we got, as it were, the heavy-handed recommendations on what one should eat from the dietary recommendations of the Americans. And all of that was terrible for us, but it was taken up almost as though there was genuine science behind it. And of course, there was really none. So then we move as from the 70s. By the way, in the 70s, and I lived through this period, so I can sort of report on it sort of directly. It was only in the late 70s, after that bad diet had been advocated for people, that the whole idea of gym culture took off, and the whole idea of getting healthy took off. So the idea of running as a remedy for one's calorie intake became the dominant thing. But from the 70s, it increased. The amount of calories that people were taking in the form of carbohydrates increased. The amount of saturated fats that people began having decreased enormously. And then you have all of the things which increased from there until you get to the 90s, really. Seed oils began to be replacing saturated fats, and then you get into the serious problems of probably from 1990 onwards, where you could see the increase in obesity just all around you. It became not something you could ignore. And it's true all over the world, all over the Western world. It is something that is rampant, and it's just a perversity that it should have become this way, to the degree that it has. But it's on top of that, on all, including childhood obesity, of course. That's what I really mean. This is the absurdity of it. This is children who have been made grossly obese, by the age of 10, by the age of, I don't know, you see it all around you. There's no denying it. If you lived through the 70s, I lived through this epidemic of eating badly. I suffered from it myself. All of this is something which has enormously damaged everyone's health, to the extent that we now see it around us. And it is obviously no joke. It is obviously something that we badly need to do something about, as Senator Robert Kennedy, or Mr. Robert Kennedy, as he's probably better called, as he's been pointing out. This is a terrible, terrible thing. But there's more on top of that. And it's the things on top of that that have taken a medical crisis and turned it into a serious derangement. A derangement that, as it were, is pointed at certain people and made certain people into the people that we now have around us, that we are now faced with as a majority every day. And the first thing is, and I have to say this, and I apologize to Americans listening, but this needs to be said. And if you don't know this yourselves, then you need to hear this from someone outside. But the whole crisis seems to have originated really in the murder of John F. Kennedy in 1963. That and the cover-up, which was so inept, which dictated that people believe things that were so absurd, and went on as it were, insisting that people believe absurdities, that this was something that had to have, as it were, other things reinforcing it. It had to go on. It had to get worse. It did get worse in the murder of Robert Kennedy and in the murder of Martin Luther King. These things were not just, as it were, events alone. And the stories that were meant to be told about all of these things were all absurd, and all could be seen through if one had enough of the genuine facts. But we were really deprived of those facts. And so people sort of shrugged and had to believe what they were told because, well, what could you do without it? I mean, we were all really forced into that position because we were deprived of first evidence, as it were, of the actual evidence, film evidence, evidence of where people were at the time, evidence of angles of shot, all of that sort of thing. Everyone was really being deprived of that. So only a few people could really form proper positions. For the rest of us, it was either believe the nonsense that you were being told and just shrug it off, or just say, well, I'm not in a position to know about this, and go on with one's life. But that can't have been the position of those who were telling those lies. They have to have had the view that they had to double down on whatever it was they were intending to do to the modern world, to the American population first, but then from the American population onwards. They had to, as it were, exert a narrative control. That was the beginning of the narrative control, which was going to get worse, which was going to require more force. Part of that narrative control became the narrative about food and what one should eat. Then there was the narrative also included in all of this of what pharmaceuticals one should take. Should one resist pharmaceuticals at all? Was one allowed to do that? Well, increasingly, one isn't allowed to. So all of this becomes, as it were, one's not telling the truth. One is religiously trying to, as William James put it, one is trying to force people to believe what it's convenient for them to believe, what it's good for them to believe. People choose to believe what they feel good about believing. Feeling good about beliefs becomes the primary thing that people are chasing after, that sort of hedonic rush of sort of a great approval in one's belief. This applies in religion, as William James wanted it to apply to, and it also applies in politics. And when people get control of that process, then they are, in a sense, forcing you to believe things that is good for them that you believe. And that's what we have had. Now, my reason for saying all of this and for thinking that this, as it were, is a galloping train that's not, as it were, galloping away randomly. It's galloping away in a particular direction, suited to particular people with a particular purpose. We have now seen that purpose with the revelations of USAID. One has seen it with how things have gone in the last 8 years, but it's actually more than that, more like 10, 20. It's really gone on since this new millennium. It's gone on in such a way that it's no longer being masked. It's no longer hidden. It is a narrative that is being controlled, and those who are controlling it are quite upfront about it, controlling the newspapers to back up their story, controlling the education system to support it, as it were, in advance. And now we're at the point where people, Europeans, but also Americans, have been told that it is the Ukrainian war, the war between Russia and Ukraine, is a war that Russia started in a motiveless invasion, and that it's Russian aggression, and it's all the fault of those Russians, all the way back. We've been told about the Russian badness all the way back to the beginning of the Trump era, etc. It was before the Trump era, in fact, but it was a prepared narrative. And the idea that it's anything other than what we've been told is now absurd to people in Europe. Don't ever hear the truth. The truth is that that war was started and controlled, the timing of it controlled by the CIA, was controlled by what is called the Maidan Revolution, which tossed out the democratically elected leader of Ukraine, replaced him with a puppet of the US, and then forced that puppet, Zelensky, into gradually moving ahead with armament to take on Russia, and with putting bases close to the Ukraine-Russian border in preparation for NATO moving into Ukraine so that there could be missiles on the border between Russia and Ukraine, on the Ukraine side, obviously, that could strike Moscow so that there would be no chance of any kind of, there would be no forewarning of it. That was the aim. And that's why Russia invaded, because of that, because of NATO's encroachment on the Russian border, so that Russia would have no chance. And then also because the Ukrainians were using their armaments to kill thousands and thousands and thousands of Russians in Ukraine, in the eastern, what are called oblasts. The war has gone terribly, terribly badly for Ukraine since then, and no one is telling that. No one is, because it goes against the narrative, no one is saying that over 1 million Ukrainians have been thrown into this cauldron, this disaster, this massacre, for no other reason than the promotion of NATO and for the desire of NATO to expand up to the borders of Russia. Russia has every right to protest against this and to say it will not stand for it, because it was a promise made in the 1990s that NATO would never do this. It was a promise that was the other half of the deal for the reunification of Germany. So there are all sorts of things that have been predicated on this promise that have been broken. So the war is not Russia's fault. Russia has behaved as an aggrieved nation that has been basically betrayed by the US and by the EU and NATO at every step. No one tells you that. You can find out this history for yourself. It is not hard to find if you go searching for it, but you will not find it in the mainstream media. You will not find it in the media in Europe at all. This means, to go back to my theme, that the derangement of human beings is now so thick and so pervasive that you are being censored in what you can hear about things. And one doesn't even need to go into the subject of COVID and all the problems about that and what all of that meant. We don't even need to touch on that subject, because by now it's not a secret that the vaccination that we were given was a very bad idea and that did not do very much at all to confront the virus. And if you still believe that it does, well, again, you're simply not paying attention to the news which is now coming out about all of the harms that the vaccination did. But I'm sure that there are still some who are quite, as it were, believing the narrative on this. I suggest that you don't, but I can understand if you do. We were all, as it were, punished for not following the narrative. And that's how all of this works. To be told that you are a bad person, a silly person, a person who's not believing us when we tell you what we want you to believe, the idea that you should be ashamed of doubting us, that is the primary method of control. If you don't believe what we are saying about the Ukraine-Russian war, then you're a pro-Putin puppet. You are, in fact, being a pro-EU puppet if you don't question it. But you're not allowed to question it. You're not allowed to question what was said about the vaccination and COVID. You weren't allowed for a long time to worry about where the problems of the COVID virus, where did it come from? Where did it come from? It came from a lab. What country was that lab situated in? That's an open question. And it's not a question that has been properly answered, and it wasn't answered for a long time because the question of what lab did it come from wasn't allowed to be asked. It's an open question. What lab did it come from? What country most benefited from the virus leaking out in the way that it did? All of these things are interesting questions, which I'm not going to go into. What I want to say, though, is that this is, as it were, the spread, how people get into narratives and how they trap themselves in it is because they don't allow any evidence that is contrary to the narrative to be allowed to be presented even to themselves. It is censored off. It is shielded off to them. And that is the state that we are now in. We have to do something, even if it's for ourselves alone, ourselves and perhaps our families. We need to do something in order to combat this. And one thing we can do is to go back to the sage advice of William Clifford and realize that what one needs is evidence for one's belief. That belief formed without evidence is unworthy of belief, which is what he said. It is unworthy of belief. All of the things which we are being pressed to believe, and for which there is some sort of slandering name which is given to those who don't believe it, rather than being presented with proper evidence and proper argument and proper discussion, you can tell this enforcement of the narrative by the fact that it is given in the form of a bad name. You are bad name inserted here if you don't believe this. For many, that is all that it takes to press them into the narrative and to not allow them to get out. Oh, I don't want to be a this and that. I don't want to be a this denier or a that denier or someone who is against all of this, because then I would be going against the science. That is absurd, absolutely absurd. And in all these cases that we've been presented with, the science was never allowed to progress in an even-handed scientific way in which all voices were heard on these subjects. We are still in the position where that is not the case. That's how you can tell. If experts in a field are not allowed to have a say in a subject which is in their field, then it is not a matter of denying the science. It is a matter of denying the politicians who have adopted a particular view about the science, which is not the same thing. Now, there's more to this whole subject of derangement on a personal level and on a political level, but given that we are now with the EU, as I say this today, possibly on the verge of World War III, which is being pressed by a NATO or an EU that does not have any weapons with which it can confront Russia, but insists on adopting the most belligerent policy against Russia, and is trying to bring the US, as it were, as back support for that aggression. We are in such a dangerous position that it is possible that this could all go terribly, terribly wrong very quickly. It could, even in the long term, it could be the case that Europe is finished. Europe cannot back up its own incredibly aggressive statements. It cannot support them. It does not have anything like an army to do that. And it keeps on saying that if Russia takes Ukraine, it will take Western Europe. It can't do that. You only have to look at how slow the progress has been, the slog of Russia in the eastern oblasts of Ukraine, in order to see that. Russia doesn't have a hope in hell of taking even all of Ukraine, let alone all of Western Europe. It doesn't have the troops for that. This is not World War II. There are not, as it were, a blitzkrieg strategy to overtake. There are many, many, many more people alive now, so that taking a country is a difficult thing. It's a very difficult thing, and it's probably, for the most part, an impossible thing. You would need a huge army. Russia is going to need a very large army to take even more than what it is now. It's going to have to bring up reserves to push further westwards. It doesn't have a hope in hell of taking Western Europe. There is not a single thing that Putin has ever said which suggests that he's going to do that. But this scare has been put to the Western Europeans to fear this, even though there is not one shred of evidence in support of it. Not one shred. So we may well be having World War III about nothing other than a narrative. Nothing other than a narrative. And the censorship of evidence and information to the population so that they don't know that they're being caught in a narrative. That is where we are. And that is why I thought this was an appropriate subject for today. It's in our personal lives, derangement, that is in our personal lives. It's in our lack of health. It is in our beliefs. It is in what is being censored from us by what people call the elites, and I won't deny that word. It is being forced upon us in an insane way, in a way that is leading to the destruction of Western Europe by the Western powers, who, for whatever reasons, are obsessed with this idea of getting Russia, which they have no chance of doing. They don't have the armaments for this. They gave away a lot of their armaments to Ukraine already, and the Ukrainians used what they could and then sold the rest. They can't do this. Britain doesn't have an army. France doesn't have much of an army. Germany doesn't. The Europeans can't put in a force in order to do this. This is what everyone needs to understand. Stop saying things saying that you're going to do things that you can't possibly do. Stop this. Stop this now. You are being absurd. All you're going to do is lead to your own destruction. And the destruction of Europe is not something that anyone would welcome. Although what I see in Starmer, if he's motivated by anything, he's motivated by the desire to destroy Britain as it stands. That is the only thing which he seems to stand for. Okay. Sorry that this turned into, as it were, a modern discussion. I would have loved for it to be more abstract, but we're in such perilous times that this has to be said. So, hope to see you again. I'm sure I will, but hope too, and that somehow sense can come to the rescue of what is a thoroughly disastrous Europe at the moment.